As we look at the content of the last chapter in the Carter text, we're going to be looking at a larger view of our social welfare state in the United States in comparison to some of the other nations around the world. There's a lot to be said for that, and this is a rather superficial sketch of that topic, as much of this text is. But in any event, this is what we have. In addition, we're going to look at some economic data regarding the distribution of wealth and poverty and such around the world. And as we close out the chapter, look at some proposals for eliminating global poverty. One thing I want to mention about this chapter, and disappoints me a little bit here as we look at international implications in social welfare, is that there is no discussion here about immigration once again, and in fact in the entire text I think immigration policy has been overlooked, and wish that in the rewrite of 2018 this had been given more attention than it has been, perhaps in future editions. So first, to look at our welfare state and to understand how it is that we seem to be so different from much of the rest of the developed world, you have to take a look at the typology of welfare states around the globe. These are concepts that we actually touched on very early in the semester, but just to bring them back to your attention, usually we look at social welfare from two different angles, and that is either the residual or the institutional perspective in social welfare. So the residual perspective in social welfare is that individuals get as little assistance as possible for the short amount of time as possible, and most likely you have to be in one way or another eligible. You have to qualify for that, usually by means testing, but there may be other ways as well. That's the residual perspective in social welfare. Whereas the institutional perspective is that essentially because you exist, because you breathe, perhaps because you've done certain things, you have a right to certain services, and so it's something that there is no stigma associated with. It's just something that is due to you because of your existence. And so that's really what amounts to two different ends of a continuum on views about social welfare. So the U.S. system is essentially based upon the residual perspective, that and some of the basic concepts that the Carter authors point out is that people enhance their well-being through their own efforts, through help with others, or from others rather, or from help with voluntary agencies, or by purchasing services themselves. There is a certain assumption there that people have equal agency in society, which is probably the one well, not the only, but one of the major drawbacks to this perspective is that everybody doesn't have equal opportunity. Everybody doesn't have equal chances to take action on their own behalves, whether that be a lack of money or a lack of status, a lack of roles in society. International comparisons. By this perspective, international comparisons should not be limited simply to governmental social programs, and we'll be looking at that in a few moments. And assistance by government by an individual is something that should be considered to be really the last resort, and even then, again, for a limited amount of time and a limited amount as you can possibly get by on, maybe even less. Now, most of the European approach, and really I think most of the rest of the developed world takes more of an institutional welfare approach. There are some variations with that, certainly, but by and large, that a variety of social programs are provided for the whole population and provided by the government in general. And that's because economic and social objectives are combined in both their philosophy and in their approach to the world, because the focus is upon enhancing the well-being of all the citizens in that society. And generally speaking, this is government government based and is not eligibility based. It's provided to everyone. Now, there's a third perspective that, or third typology of welfare states that Karger and his associate also talks about, which is corporatist welfare. It's also referred to as social corporatism, and this is something that's more typical of the Nordic states. Now, probably the most socialized form of social welfare programs, as far as the government systems and social programs are concerned, really occurs within the Scandinavian nations, and Karger says that this is based upon largely upon a social partnership between the interests of capital and labor, and so there is the government intervenes and mediates a bargaining between representatives of employers and of labor in order to attain certain benefits for the society members, and the compromise between labor and capital is very much emphasized here. This suggests a certain existence of a union or unionization, at least, of labor that I mean, they don't really talk about it in their description, but it's certainly implied that labor is able to pull their forces together to negotiate as an equal with, again, with the government intervening with the capitalists. So, these typologies really give expression to the beliefs about the desirability of government involvement in social welfare programming. And as we've talked about throughout the semester, in the United States, of course, there is, particularly more recently, there's been a big push towards getting the government out of the middle of social welfare programming. Now, well, we'll save that for later. So one of the things we want to do is look at government expenditures for social welfare in comparison to other nations in the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development, the OECD nations. And these are, I believe, what is a group of nations that really represent the most advanced and maybe industrialized nations of the world. And you see here that the United States ranks 23rd in total government expenditures. At least the text says 23rd. I don't know if you count the number of bars. It may not be 23 down, but the point is there you see that red line. It's pretty far down, and most of the nations, once again, you see a lot of the Scandinavian nations more to the left, where there's more direct social spending by the government. So this is what you call net cash direct public social expenditure, and we don't look so good compared to the other nations in the world with this map. When you include tax breaks for social purposes, these are some of the things like the earned income tax credit and things that we've talked about earlier. The United States begins to look much more similar to its European counterparts. Sort of in the middle here of all the nations with more net social spending than countries like New Zealand, Norway, Australia, Canada, and so on. So this is the percentage of GDP, by the way, gross domestic product, that we're measuring here. And remember, we talked about early in the semester that GDP doesn't take into account cost of living and that kind of thing. So a nation may have a high GDP, but that doesn't necessarily mean that everybody's sharing in the wealth. The cost of living may be very high also, and so that reduces the benefits, let's say, of a high GDP. So this is just based upon raw gross domestic product figures. Now, when you look at private sector expenditures, and when you include them into the mix, we rank second in the world, only behind France, as a matter of fact. And so this I think kind of places emphasis on something we talked about very early in the semester, which is the role that the private sector plays in our social welfare programming at present. So one of the questions I had is what does a private sector expenditure involve? Because it seems a pretty vague kind of a thing, and I went to, it's actually a Austrian website that looked at, in fact, these maps that I just went over, rather the charts that I just gave you, are from that website as well. And it talks about the difference between mandatory private social expenditure and voluntary private social expenditure. So, for instance, you may have the mandatory things may be that the government requires sick leave for employees, for instance. That in this particular model, that's considered a private social expenditure, or benefits that accrue from mandatory contributions to private insurance funds, those kinds of things. Voluntary social expenditure includes programs such as pensions and child care support and employment related health plans. So, your employer's contribution, let's say if you have an employer-based health insurance program, your employer's contribution to your health insurance, which is usually pretty substantial and more than the employee's contribution, is considered a social welfare expenditure. So we don't typically, when we talk about social welfare, we don't typically consider that to be a part of it. But I believe if you look at the European system, you find that things that are paid for, well, for instance, in healthcare, you don't have, well, there is some employer-based social health insurance in Europe, in some of the countries and things like this. But I mean, the government health insurance programs, the government is essentially making the contribution towards health insurance that by its share of the expenses that your employer may do here. So this also includes benefits provided by non-governmental organizations, and one of the reasons I went digging and I didn't get a good answer for this was whether or not things like, say the Gates Foundation is building a community center, let's say in your city. Is this considered a private social expenditure? And I think it would be a voluntary private social expenditure. So you see, it involves a lot of things that are purely voluntary, and also, of course, the concern I have with this, and I want to leave you with this, the fact that we rely so heavily on private social agency interventions in social welfare isn't necessarily the same thing as if we had government intervention, because when you have private agencies providing social welfare benefits, those agencies define their clientele, and they can exclude clientele. Now the government can do the same as well, but they're less. The government is less likely to exclude clientele based on certain characteristics of the population or something like that. Religious organizations may restrict their benefits to individuals that belong to their religion. You know, or deny certain services based upon their religious views. Um, for that matter, even voluntary organizations, maybe don't do outreach. Don't try to get people to come in to engage in services and things like this. So, there may be somebody down the street who's starving that nobody really, he doesn't belong to any organizations. He doesn't go to a church, and people may not be aware of him, and that person may not be getting any benefits at all. Public expenditures work to ensure more even distribution of benefits, and that's one of the reasons why I think relying too much on private interventions can create problems for parts of our population. So, what is it about our unwillingness to adopt the European model? I mean, why are we so reluctant about that? That's one of the questions that I pose to my introductory course students on social welfare. We read a book by Karen Seacom called "So You Think I Drive a Cadillac." I think I've mentioned this to you before, and it looks at welfare recipients' experiences in the system. It's a very good book if you're looking for one that you want some additional reading on. A little hard to get hardback copies anymore. It's available online, but in any event, she spends the last 2 or 3 chapters of that book looking at European systems as well, and asks that same question. Why is it that we can't do what those nations seem to do well? Now, there are a number of different suggestions here in the Carter text. First of all, that the diversity that we have in our nation, racially, ethnically, religiously, and so on, prevents the emergence of a comprehensive welfare state. Many of the European nations now, at least historically, have been much more. They haven't had the immigration that the United States has had, and it's really kind of built the nation upon is immigration, and I'll take that back to immigration beginning with the Jamestown settlers. The Native Americans, of course, are the only ones that didn't immigrate, and so all these waves of immigrants ever since the Mayflower and Jamestown and those early settlements, I mean, have brought new ideas and new values, new needs and things like that to our nation. And so this is very different from many of the nations in Europe. Now, many of those nations now have more immigration because of the refugee crisis that's going on, particularly the Middle Eastern uh, refugees. And so that's changing some, and it's also putting some strain, I think, on their systems as well. But this is one reason why some people believe, at least, it is that we don't have this comprehensive system that Europe has. Europeans are more united and have a stronger sense of civic responsibility. There's more of an investment in the well-being of all citizens in the nations in most European nations, and that underlies their willingness to pay additional taxes in order to provide services not only for themselves but for their fellow man as well. And as much as we want to think that we're a nation that cares about each other. The fact is we just don't have that in our national consciousness as much as other nations in the world do. We have different groups that pursue separate interests, and whether they're lobbying for different ideas in Congress or they just go about things very differently, and this really works against the development of a single national system. Our political system is more decentralized. A lot of and this goes back and forth, but I mean, a lot of the power, particularly in the area of social services, is distributed and handed out to the states. And so, politically based institutions, national political institutions, develop less often. We don't have that long tradition of bureaucracy that European nations have, and going back to the feudal days, even where decisions were centralized, in the castles of the lords and things like that. We just don't have that long of a history of a strong central government. And in fact, the whole nation was established in the sense that the strong federal government, a strong centralized government, was something that, was strongly debated in the earliest days of our nation. The three branches of our government, at sometimes, as well as the strong political interest groups, work against a strong central power, so that if one branch, one individual, one philosophy takes hold and begins to become dominating, the other branches, the other political interests will come in and will work to modify and change that. We don't have strong unions in this nation anymore. We did at one time for a period of time, and that was during a period of time when social welfare programming was in its ascendancy in this nation. Um, Unionization is stronger, and worker rights and things like that, I think, are better protected in many of the European nations. Cleavages develop in American society that prevents the development of a strong, centralized, comprehensive welfare state. And I think probably those cleavages are more evident today than at any other time in my life, in my own life at least. And finally, that great American value of individualism is opposed to collective responsibility. The idea that everybody should take care of themselves and stand on their own and earn their own keep, and that kind of thing is a, we may consider it noble and a wise thing, but remember that has to do with the fact that we've been taught this, and previous generations have been taught this, and it's been drilled into us over and over and over again. It doesn't necessarily mean it's the correct or the right thing or the moral thing. It just means that's what we believe. A little bit again about history, a little bit much more superficial here, but I mean, uh, after World War II and the Great Depression really Roosevelt's during that period of time, Roosevelt's administration established the New Deal and the Social Security Act, and unions got more of a foothold in our society, and worker rights became more dominant, and there was more of a focus on helping needy people. These kinds of attitudes really kind of kept hold through several successive administrations, Republican and Democrat. Um, and there was even a bit of a liberal social agenda advanced by Republicans as well, at least through well, even past Nixon, I think. So the belief existed that we should strengthen human capital in order to make people more economically competitive. We needed to ensure that individuals had a fair shake and an equal opportunity if they were going to be able to be competitive economically. And so programs were set up to help those individuals in areas of education, employment, health, housing, those kinds of things. And for those individuals who weren't able to compete in the free market, social insurance programs were put in place. And so we had two focuses really here, which was first creating programs to increase human capital, to help people compete in the market, and then those programs to subsidize those who were unable to participate in the workforce. Ronald Reagan was elected in 1980, and it was called a revolution. It was more of a reaction than a revolution, I would say. And really, the United States position as far as the kind of welfare system we were going to have deteriorated greatly as there was a retrenchment of social welfare programs during that administration, and this neoliberal philosophy, which we had talked about way back at the beginning of the semester, really kind of took hold in those days. The idea being that if you get help from the government, welfare, that it should be conditional on things like your employment, participating in the workforce, or at least trying to participate in the workforce, and other norms. And I put that in quotes. It's mentioned in the text, but other norms meaning, really living a moral life. There was a strong focus upon morality that has grown. That has a lot to do with the influence of the moral majority during this period of time. They continue to have a foothold in politics, and it does influence a lot of the programs. It's certainly evident, um, if not through the personal behaviors of our leaders necessarily, at least through the philosophies that they do preach sometimes to us, is really got a lot to do with morality as well. Um, what were social entitlements in the Social Security Act in many respects have been changed to discretionary programs. Not People don't have a right to things now. They have to apply and be eligible and do certain things in order to get help. Um, there's a belief that government growth should be contained, particularly in the area of social assistance, and family and community organizations should take more responsibility. This really goes back, to the beliefs of the 1840s and 1830s. Back when, remember, Franklin Roosevelt vetoed the 5 Million Acre Act, that wouldn't provide assistance to the improved mental health facilities that Dorothea Dix had campaigned for. These are philosophies that go back, a couple hundred years, and these are philosophies that we're living today. And also, during this era, it's another significant thing, is that services and benefits were contracted out to the private sector, but this included for profits. So you have more private sector reliance on private sector, 1,000 points of light and volunteer organizations and private sector agencies, more of a reliance upon that to provide for the social welfare needs of America. And again, I tell you, not with the same kind of assurance as to the equal distribution of benefits. And for-profit agencies were also able to benefit from federal grants and federal funds, which means that some of the money that is set aside for social welfare needs go into the pockets of some of the leaders and workers in those agencies, and that further reduces welfare benefits for individuals who are needy. Bill Clinton, his election in 1990 gave hope, at least at first, to a lot of people on the left because, although he did campaign on the idea of ending welfare as we know it, there was still a hope that his political philosophies would perhaps bring social welfare back into some sort of ascendancy after the Reagan and first Bush era. But midterm in his first administration is not unusual. We've seen it recently. We saw it during the Obama administration. I think also during the second Bush administration. The first midterm elections, Republicans, the other party, took over Congress, and it was a very conservative reaction led by Newt Gingrich, and a big focus upon personal responsibility. This is where the welfare to work whole welfare to work stuff developed from, and Clinton had to move to the center much more, and perhaps even to the right of center, in order to stay in the White House, and to get compromise with the very conservative Congress during that time. And so really the the conservative approach in social policy continued to strengthen, I think, during this time, and even many liberals, such as Clinton and other thinkers, began to recognize the need to kind of walk more of a middle line. And so these mainstream activities of work and traditional morality were further emphasized as a condition for receiving social welfare benefits. And we've said that it was a part of the Welfare Reform Act, the TANF regulations, focused not only upon work but also upon, like, teen pregnancy, the teens having to live at home, and emphasis upon more of a valuation of marriage and the two-parent family. The Defense of Marriage Act passed in Congress during this time, and in fact, Clinton is criticized by many individuals because he signed the Defense of Marriage Act. Clinton said he had to sign it because there was such a strong movement afoot in the nation at that time, with the influence of the evangelical right, to sanctify a marriage between a man and a woman by making it a constitutional amendment. And he was concerned that if he didn't sign that into law, that would just force a reaction basically against the right, and that what would result would be a constitutional amendment, which would certainly be more difficult to alter in the future. And so once again, he found himself kind of weaving the center line there in order to to protect what little there was left of progressivism from the Roosevelt era. The economic collapse occurs at the end of the George W. Bush administration, and this was a worldwide issue that caused a lot of nations to begin to reconsider their own social welfare programming. Now, mind you, social welfare programming remains strong in European nations, so don't get the idea that they've gone as far to the right as the United States has, because they haven't. But nonetheless, there is a deficit crisis in some of those nations that were less good at managing their budget. And if you listen to the news, you heard about conflicts in Greece and Spain and Ireland, and the European Union having to kind of step in and discipline them and impose austerity measures on their government and things like this. In the United States, we had the Tea Party developing on the right, the Occupy Wall Street, that whole philosophy about opposition to the wealthy 1% developing on the left. Both of them really in response to this. This conflict about what to do with social welfare, and about wealth, the disparity of wealth in the United States, and so on. Now, these neoliberal views continue to constrain the welfare state and welfare states around the world. But in the United States, during the Obama administration, and again, a president who was disappointing to a lot of his supporters, in that he wasn't more progressive. By his second administration, became more progressive in a lot of his social welfare activities, and but still he had a very conservative Congress that, as you may be aware, struggled and fought with him, from the very beginning, when he, the Republican leadership of the Senate's on record. I mean, this is history, that in their first meeting after his election in 2008, they made a plan basically to not approve anything he proposed, and they were going to make him a one-term president. They didn't succeed at that, but they were trying to do that. Now, one thing I want to say about this, the text has this sort of gloomy kind of look about social welfare, and again, it's going to be mentioned before I'm done talking here. That the idea about social welfare is over, and that kind of thing, that social welfare state's coming to an end, and the perspective that the author of my text in my introductory course, Phyllis Day, her perspective is that it's really a pendulum swing. And if you look through our history over and over and over again, you'll find times when it looked as though, the progressivism of certain administrations or certain times was pushed back because of, a reaction to the kinds of things that were being put in place. But then some kind of economic thing happens, and in people, there's more of a need for support again in society and things, and we swing back towards more of a social welfare state once again. Now, whether or not we're ever going to reach in America a point where we have you know, uh, the kind of social welfare state we had following the Great Depression and the Roosevelt era remains to be seen. I mean, we have candidates now in the Democratic Party that are campaigning kind of further to the left than Democrats have done for quite a number of years. And so, what I think the end result of this is going to be, because the other side of things is, of course, there's the tug to the right. I think the end result of this is that you're going to see some of the social programs. I suspect we're going to see more progression towards uh, uh, development of more social programming and social progressiveness again, whether it be through a modified health insurance program. Certainly, the current administration works to do away with the Affordable Care Act, but Congress has made it pretty clear they're not going to just drop it without putting something in its place, and hopefully we'll see some movement. If not a single payer insurance, something in that direction. And a lot of the nations in Europe have systems that blend um, capitalism with socialism in their social programs and things like this. And I think we can find ourselves moving in that direction as well. Also, in terms of higher education, as you know, many nations in Europe offer free higher education to qualifying young persons, and meanwhile in America, you guys all go in deep in debt in order to get your degrees. And I think this is going to change over time. So you may or may not be aware of the Gini coefficient. I know I've spoken about this in other courses, but the Gini coefficient measures it takes a look at the income inequalities in a nation. And so the country, if every resident had the same income in a country, their Gini coefficient would be zero. Whereas if in that country only one person had all the income, the coefficient would be one. Although usually you see it as 100, and in this map it's 100. The book talks about them as, point 0.4. This map and most of the references that I see would say 40. But in any event, you get the notion here that the lower the number, the greater the distribution of income, the more equal the income is. Um, Now, first of all, this is about income, and this does not necessarily mean wealth. And remember, income and wealth are two different things. Wealth is money, making money. Income is, money you have coming in because of your efforts and things like this. And perhaps the Gini coefficient income may include interest earned on your money. I don't know, but this doesn't mean wealth. This means income. And there are other measures of. There's a Gini wealth coefficient, and I looked and looked and looked. The only thing I can find are long tables of countries on the wealth coefficient. I couldn't find a good map of it, so it's not. If you're really interested in this, you can explore that on the web. But you see here that uh, our nation is, you know, um, not the highest by any stretch of imagination, but certainly not the lowest either in terms of income distribution here. And that's probably not surprising to anybody. Now, if you look, you can find Gini coefficients maps that show you state by state. how the income distribution is in each state in the United States. Interestingly, Alaska is, again, looking at income only, not wealth, but income. Alaska has got one of the better Gini coefficients of all the states in the United States, which is a bit of a surprise to me given the poverty, the depth of poverty that exists in some of our rural areas. And it suggests to me that earnings may not be as great in Alaska as they are in other nations or other states in the nation. I don't know. But if you looked at the Gini coefficient, for instance, New York would be bright red. And so there are parts of the United States, I'm, um, yeah, there are parts of the United States that would be much more unequal than what our average is in this map. Again, you can look that up if you want to. Now, um, an interesting comparison is about the distribution of wealth, and this is not a Gini coefficient, but it it does talk about wealth, and I'm guessing this is probably income and wealth, not just wealth. But you see here the comparison of the distribution of wealth around the world, and this is a per capita, I believe, map of the wealth of nations in per capita US dollars. So per adult rather, not per capita. And so here you see, as this graphic says, North America and Europe together account for 60% of the total wealth of households on the globe, although they only contain 17% of the global adult population. That's pretty remarkable when you look at that. This is where the wealth is concentrated. Now, compare that again to the distribution of income. Um, there are differences, and um, uh, it would take some time to kind of analyze what the meaning is of that. For instance, the Gini coefficient in Canada is relatively low. And really in the United States and in parts of Europe, and yet when you look at the map of wealth, that's where all the wealth is. And so you have to kind of sit and think about that and play with those figures and toss it around a little bit to figure out what that means. This map, by the way, I believe comes from Swiss Bank, I believe, a financial institution. These, I believe, are United Nations maps. I'm not sure, but another way, aside from the Gini index, another way to gauge the progress of nations is the Human Development Index. And this in some respects could be more meaningful, because what this does is it takes life expectancy, educational attainment, and per capita income and combines them as measures of well-being. Now, notably, this doesn't include anything about environmental issues or you know anything like quality of life, perhaps, or anything like this. But this is purely measuring development through life, the length of your life, how much education individuals get, and how much income is earned. And here again, you see the United States and Europe and Australia, parts of South America, Argentina, Chile, having doing much better than the rest of the globe. And the same thing as the Gini index, where the distribution of income was extremely great in Central Africa. That talks about in real poverty there. The same thing here. You see that Africa, in particular India, um, doesn't do very well. Now, you also note here that China is not doing well as far as the HDI is concerned. Um, and the World Bank, we're going to touch on that in a minute. Individuals are critical of the World Bank these days because China gets so much help from the World Bank, and meanwhile China is doing very well economically, and we're the leadership of our nation is concerned that they're beginning to move ahead of us and these kinds of things. So I don't know how old this particular map is. I couldn't get dates off of these things. I look for them, but some of these maps may be 10 years old. Some of them may be more recent. Another way to look at the progress of the nation, this is extreme poverty. The book talks about the fourth world. This is the first time I've ever heard of that. And the reason the fourth world developed was because, the after World War II, we had the first world, which were the relatively wealthy, democratic, capitalist nations of Europe and North and South America, or well, North America at least. And then the second world was the communist nations. The third world were the all the other nations, and the first world and the second world competed during the Cold War, and since in order to gain influence over the third world, and doing that by aid and military help and things like that. Well, um, first of all, one thing that happened is that communism really collapsed in a lot of the nations, not all of them, but many of the nations of the second world. And so the second world isn't so much a feature anymore. Plus, you have China, becoming as economically strong as North America, perhaps, maybe even more so than Europe. And meanwhile, in the third world, you have the oil-rich nations becoming also very wealthy and no longer really being underdeveloped, but there are other nations that are left behind that are extremely underdeveloped, and this is again mostly Central Africa. So those are the fourth world countries. And so this map shows percent of population living below 125 per day in 2011 in US dollars. So this is a based on World Bank 2018 API, which ranges from 1995 to 2017. So I gather again here that some of these figures may be old. Um, One of the things that does tell you, is a little surprising to me, that this map suggests that 5% of our nation lives in extreme poverty. I probably told you earlier, but I'll say it again. There's a movie called The City of God about the poverty in Rio de Janeiro, and it's worth watching. It's tells you a little bit about an effort upon the part of the government to provide housing and services to the extremely poor individuals in Rio. And what happened to that. It's a very disturbing film, but worth watching if you're interested in global poverty. Another film I would recommend, I've mentioned earlier in the semester, I believe, when we looked at the Born Rich film, is called Born into Brothels, about young girls being raised in brothels in India. Another good look at extreme poverty and what that means on a global basis. University professor, and not that doesn't mean he's a professor at this university. The university professor is like the ultimate status, I guess, at Columbia University. And Jeffrey Sachs, he's an economist and a public policy analysis, had a global strategy he proposed to end poverty by 2025. That's very, very ambitious, I'd say. And these minimum standards would be the way to measure that. And these are things, I think these are elements that you're going to hear mentioned again and again in the next few slides about individuals, what can be done to end poverty in the globe. Primary education for all children, adequate nutrition for all vulnerable populations, anti-malarial bed nets. There's some criticism about that because those things wind up getting swiped in delivery and then get sold in the black market for other purposes and things like this. But the idea is to cut down on malaria is a major problem in Africa, I believe in particular. I think the Gates Foundation has worked on trying to eliminate malaria, if I remember correctly. Um, Potable water and sanitation facilities, pave roads, and they have a standard, I think, of a half a mile per 1,000 individuals in a population, and then access to cooking fuels and stoves that reduce indoor pollution, rather, I should say. Now, these are some things I think that make sense. Some good ways to measure the reduction in poverty is nutrition, education, health, sanitation, basics. The United Nations looks for commitments from the developed world to dedicate 0.7% of their gross national product for foreign aid. And if that were provided Sachs believes that global poverty could be ended by 2025 at the cost of $124 billion. I don't know. It doesn't seem like such a great figure, such a huge figure when you think about this globally, but there may be things I don't understand about that. Now, his plan is criticized by other economists, and one of them says that there are really four traps of success that intrude upon this, and that first is chronic civil conflict, which exists in many of the underdeveloped nations. Um, Discovery of natural resources. Other nations move in when there's Europe, or rather Africa. As there's been discovery of oil there, and some of the dominant nations have kind of stepped in and tried to take ownership of the oil there in those poor countries and things like that. Being geographically landlocked, and I assume that suggests that if you don't have ports, by the time resources get to you, they've had to run the gauntlet to get to you. And then finally, corrupt governance, which is a big issue in many of the underdeveloped nations. That leaders are either corrupt, inept, or they just, their local governments don't coordinate things properly, and the end result is that a lot of these things don't get to the people who need them. There's a concept called capability poverty, which is discussed in this chapter, and that is our Amartya Sen is an economist, I believe, from India, who developed this concept. The idea that the expansion of the capabilities of persons to lead the kind of lives that they value and have a reason to value is what this is focused upon. His concepts are things such as that greater freedom is a precondition of development. Greater freedom means people are able to help themselves and to have influence on the world. Agency, to have agency. Deprivation of basic requirements for survival and inadequate institutions that deny education, health, and recreation subverts the possibility of full participation. If you look back to what we were just talking about, the traps about alleviating poverty in the fourth world, that's what he's talking about here. And he believes that the countries don't need to wait until they're wealthy in order to improve their education, healthcare, or to provide an adequate program for social services. That if they go about doing that, their wealth is going to expand as a result. And you can see that said really, the kinds of things he's talking about here really is democracy, right? I mean, in many respects, and he sees two historical truths that are very significant and seem to be true. One is that there are no records of famine existing in any democratic society. That always happens in nations that are underdeveloped and run by despots generally. And there are no wars that have ever been waged between two democratic societies. The events that are caused by non-democratic decision making are the things that lead to war and famine, and these are events, or rather decisions, that exclude large groups of people, and those are the individuals who suffer from the flawed policies of the government. Those are pretty profound thoughts. When we talk about uh, in politics about social welfare in the United States, these days is sort of like, are we democratic or are we socialist? And you know, socialism is seen as a political institution, and it's really more of an economic philosophy. Now, communism has been the political face of socialism. I think it's mismanaged socialism, but that's, unfortunately, that's what Americans associate socialism with, and that's why, like, for instance, the Republicans are going to be focusing on the Democrats, proposing socialist programs and things. You're going to hear that more and more and more as the elections approach, because Americans are afraid of socialism. And the thing is, democracy is political, socialism, and economic, and the two of them can occur together. And this is what we see in Europe by and large, and in the Nordic, in the Scandinavian countries, a blend of democracy and socialism. Now, it's not perfect by any means over there either, but it has been functioning successfully throughout the last century in those nations, and perhaps longer. And so this is the kind of thing I think, it isn't a matter of being capitalist or totally socialist, or not being democratic, not having a democracy and having socialism. It is about having a democracy that weaves socialism into its economic and social policies. I think that's what these thinkers, Sen and Nussbaum and Sachs and other people are saying here, basically. Martha Nussbaum, who is, I think, an attorney, a lawyer, and a philosopher, who, last I heard, teaches at the University of Chicago, a deep thinker, and she's really into the capability of poverty thing that Sen proposed, and she adds to his philosophy focusing upon women around the world, and said that the optimal development is not only freedom from want, which is what I think Sen's philosophy really focuses on, but really is also the full enjoyment of a range of social and political opportunity. And she recognizes that women around the globe continue to lack that on the equal footing with males. Sachs criticized the priorities of the Obama administration, noticing that $100 billion was spent fighting the Taliban in Afghanistan, whereas only 10 billion was devoted to the poor conditions in Africa and sub-Saharan Africa in particular. Is just terrible conditions there. April 2019, Jimmy Carter, there was a news item that President Trump had called President Carter to talk about China. Relations with China were, well, everybody thinks Nixon opened the door to China, but the relations were normalized finally during the Carter administration, I believe, and Trump turned to him because he's concerned that China is getting ahead of the United States, and Carter said, "Yeah, they are kind of, and you should be concerned about that." And he wants to know, Carter says, "Why is that?" He says, "When you look at it, since 1979, China has not been to war at all, except for a minor border skirmish with Vietnam. But the United States has been at war almost constantly since that time." Carter says, due to a desire to impose American values on other nations. Whereas China invests its resources in projects such as high speed railroads and infrastructure development and doesn't put that so much on defense spending, Carter says we have wasted as much as $3 trillion on American military spending. China hasn't wasted a single penny on war, and Carter says that's why they're ahead of us in almost every way. He says if you take $3 trillion, which is what he says we've spent on the military in the last 40 years, and if we put that into American infrastructure, he said we'd probably have $2 trillion left over. And in addition to that, we'd have a high speed railroad, we'd have bridges that aren't collapsing, we'd have roads that are maintained properly, and our education system would be as good as any in the world. And so it's a bit of an aside perhaps when we look at global national development, but America could probably do a much better, well, could do a better job at taking care of its own infrastructure and its own people if we were able to get away from all this defense spending. The most advanced economic nations like the United States and Japan spend less as a percentage of their gross national product and commitments to foreign aid than do the smaller industrialized nations. Now, we are the largest governmental donor, but our percentage of GNP is the lowest among industrialized nations, and compared to where we were in the mid 1980s, is about half of what it once was. So think about that. Where's our money going? If we're not really spending it in our nations, I mean, not like we could be, and we're not sending it out in foreign aid like we used to. It seems like we're losing a lot of money in war. Maybe there's other expenses that I'm not considering here, but that certainly is what seems like Jimmy Carter thinks, at least. So while we have the lowest percentage of GNP being devoted to foreign aid, for instance, again, the Scandinavian welfare states demonstrate better patterns of international citizenship than those countries that are closer to capitalist nations do. And there's a table 18.2 in the text which shows this data. Governmental developmental aid has been uneven since 1990, and there's more and more and more of a reliance on non-governmental organizations and world financial institutions like the World Bank and the IMF to help these developing nations and to deal with those particular issues that haunt those nations. Again, the Gates Foundation, the Carter Center, I think has also been involved in elimination of disease in Africa and India, as I recall. And, it is a lot of those private foundations that are being relied upon now to take care of these things. Um, the global capital resources, these are these are organizations you're going to hear about from time to time when we talk about poverty and wealth in the world. The International Monetary Fund, the IMF, um, had I think that developed after. I'm not positive about this. I think this developed um, after World War II. I may be wrong about that, but it essentially one of the things it's done is it's it's an institution that loans money, I think, to underdeveloped nations to help them get caught up with the rest of the world. But um, one of the things it's done after the financial collapse, in particular, the global financial collapse, the 2007, 2008, in that area, they've worked to restructure debt payments for those third world countries, or fourth world countries, I suppose, in order to help them get caught up and to make their payments. But in doing that, they've required these nations to reduce their domestic spending for education, health, and social programs. So consider what that does then to those basic kinds of things we were just talking about we need to alleviate poverty. Here the IMF is putting restrictions on those governments taking care of their own people. It seems to me that's just going to continue to exacerbate poverty. The World Bank, another organization, offers financial credits and long-term interest-free loans to nations. The World Trade Organization, another organization that is somewhat controversial, and you often see demonstrations outside the WTO meetings and things like this. The WTO developed to accelerate the emergence of global markets and to encourage private financial investments in developing nations. But the benefits of the expansion of global markets isn't distributed equally, and it's not surprising. As, when we all the things we've heard about this semester, is all about unequal distribution of resources, and this goes on globally as well. The per capita gross domestic product of the most developed third of the nations has increased significantly, while the middle third and the lowest third have seen drops in their per capita GDP. And the World Bank says that this shows how difficult it is for poor countries to close that gap with their wealthier counterparts. There have been improvements in some of those development goals involving things like extreme poverty, primary education, safe drinking water, but issues still remain in many nations regarding health and sanitation standards. And even among those poorer nations, these accomplishments are distributed unequally, with China and India showing the greatest advances, but the countries of sub-Saharan Africa are growing worse. And there are some social entrepreneurial models for change, including microcredit and taxes on financial trading called the Robin Hood tax that are proposed to help provide funding. Um, you can read more about that in the chapter if you're really interested in that. But there are different ways, again, that seem to be looking more towards the capitalist system in order to resolve the needs of the poor. And When you look at how capitalism works in our nation and how the poor are dealt with in our nation, I don't know that capitalism and is the system we want to rely upon to alleviate poverty. But as I mentioned earlier, there are economists and historians that think the golden age of the welfare state and the social democratic moment have passed. Um, Again, I would tell you that's one philosophy, and so I'm not so gloomy about the future with this. And I think that what Day says is right. And the forces of history, the forces of mankind, are going to see a swing of the pendulum back towards uh, a more a kinder kind of idea about helping people, and more of a focus again on take care of human needs and developing human capital. Issues like immigration, for instance, and all the kinds of problems that are developing from that, with human trafficking, undocumented workers, refugees, not only across our southern border, but all over Europe and other parts of the world because of the carnage that's going on in the Middle East right now. Uh, these things are things that they're gonna force nations, yes, to certainly consider what kinds of programs they can afford, but are going to also force nations to realize that there are needs, human needs, they're um, going to have to be dealt with, and how long can we rely upon the beneficence beneficence of wealthy people to take care of the problems of the world. Governments are going to have to take responsibility for these things, and that's why I believe that, the pendulum is going to swing back, and we're going to see more social democratic modems in the future. All right, well, that's again stepping down off my soapbox, and I hope that you find food for thought in this lecture, and let me know if, as always, if there are any thoughts or questions you have as a result of this. Thanks.